Good morning, everybody. My name is JP Tasker from CBC News, and I'll be the moderator today. We have today Stéphane Perrault from the Chief Elections Officer from Elections Canada. He'll be presenting his recommendations report from the 43rd and 44th general elections. So please, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Simplement souligner le fait que je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé des Algonquins Anishinabés qui habitent et chérissent ce territoire depuis des milliers d'années. Alors, ce matin, j'ai eu le plaisir de remettre au président de la Chambre des communes mon rapport de recommandation qui fait suite aux élections générales de 2019-2021. Ce rapport comprend 32 recommandations de modifications législatives qui, à mon avis, amélioreraient le processus électoral canadien. Je tiens d'abord à préciser que le Canada jouit d'une démocratie électorale qui est saine, fondée sur un cadre électoral dans lequel les Canadiens continuent d'avoir confiance. Alors que le recul de la démocratie dans le monde suscite passablement d'inquiétude, les sondages indiquent que les Canadiens sont pratiquement unanimes à considérer que nos élections sont libres et équitables et qu'ils ont confiance dans les résultats de l'élection. Cette position enviable est attribuable, du moins en partie, au fait que la loi électorale du Canada est révisée périodiquement en fonction des nouvelles réalités. Alors, le rapport déposé aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans cette importante tradition d'amélioration continue. Il marque le début d'une conversation, non seulement avec les parlementaires, mais aussi, j'espère, avec les Canadiens intéressés à l'évolution de notre cadre électoral et à sa capacité de répondre aux nouveaux défis et aux attentes changeantes. Mon rapport se divise en deux parties. La première partie aborde divers enjeux qui se rapportent à la réglementation des communications électorales à l'ère numérique. La seconde traite de l'administration des élections ainsi que des services aux électeurs et aux candidats. Ensemble, les recommandations visent à rendre le processus électoral plus transparent, plus résilient aussi et plus accessible à tous les électeurs et aux candidats. Mes recommandations sur les communications électorales visent principalement à accroître la transparence de celles-ci lorsque les partis, les candidats ou les tiers ont recours à des moyens de communication électronique. La loi électorale du Canada a été rédigée en bonne partie à une époque où les communications électorales se faisaient principalement par le moyen de publicité dans la presse écrite, à la radio et à la télévision. Elle ne tient donc pas compte ou pas suffisamment compte, à mes yeux, de divers moyens de communication électronique, qu'on pense à la messagerie texte, à des vidéos en ligne ou simplement à des pages web. Il est temps de revoir les dispositions pour qu'elles couvrent un plus large éventail de communication électorale et permettent aux électeurs de savoir qui s'adresse à eux dans le contexte d'une élection. Les campagnes électorales gagneraient également en transparence si les plateformes numériques publiaient leurs politiques sur la publicité et la modération des contenus et si les exigences relatives au registre des publicités électorales introduites en 2018 étaient améliorées pour que les registres donnent une vue d'ensemble des publicités commanditées par les partis et par les autres participants. My report also makes a number of recommendations that seek to address concerns about some of the serious threats facing democratic institutions for the past few years. These include disinformation campaigns that aim to undermine the legitimacy of elections or of the results, the potential use of foreign funding by third parties, as well as the emergence of hate speech against targeted groups. These are difficult topics that simply cannot be ignored, even though the solutions may be imperfect. I've made a number of recommendations that seek to increase the resiliency of our electoral democracy in the face of such challenges, and I look forward to working with parliamentarians to build on my recommendations. Finally, a number of recommendations seek to improve voter services, to remove barriers, and increase opportunities for all electors to exercise their right to vote. For instance, several recommendations seek different avenues to reduce the number of late mail-in ballots, as we saw in the last election. This includes, for example, allowing pre-read applications for special ballots, moving the deadline for candidate nominations, and extending the minimum length of the election period for a non-fixed election, fixed date election from 37 to 44 days. Another recommendation aims at avoiding situations such as the one that occurred in 2019, where a fixed date election was in conflict with an important religious holiday. Finally, there are a number of measures to better serve electors in long-term care facilities and those requiring assistance to vote. While this report contemplates a number of improvements to our electoral process, it is also important to note that not all improvements require legislative changes. For instance, the last election showed the need for improvements in how we engage with and offer services to Indigenous Canadians. This can be pursued within the existing regime, and work in that area has begun, but it will be essential to listen to Indigenous communities as we seek to make improvements. I also note potential changes that are not in this report and that relate to elements of the supply and confidence agreement reached by the Liberal and New Democratic parties, dealing with 2 additional days of voting as well as allowing electors to vote anywhere in their electoral district. This does not mean that those proposals should not be pursued, but merely that discussions on the way to achieve the desired outcomes and the timeframes for doing so are just beginning. And I would be certainly happy to discuss these matters further with parliamentarians in order to consider various options and establish milestones moving forward. This report, as I indicated at the outset, is the beginning of an important conversation with parliamentarians and Canadians on ways to improve our electoral process. It is a critical exercise that we must periodically undertake to ensure the vitality of our democracy in the face of evolving circumstances, challenges, and aspirations. So thank you, and I will now take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perrault. Can I just ask you to tilt your microphone down right in front of you? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. So, all right, so if you are on Zoom, please use the raise hand function on your system there, and we will get to you after we work through the questions that we have here in front of us in the room. And I assume, Ms. Lawson, you're also available for questions as well? Perfect. All right. So we'll start first, please, with Ashley Burke from CBC News. Go ahead.
Good morning. My first question is about one of your recommendations is to make it illegal to spread false information specifically about the voting process. Are there some examples that you can provide of that happening in Canada and what your concerns are?
We've all heard misinformation or incorrect information, and I don't want today to be giving out specific examples that would fit what I'm proposing here, because that would be making assumptions about the knowledge and the intent of people making those declarations. So I'll stay away from concrete examples that we saw, but certainly, to me, this is about drawing a line in the sand on a matter of principle. It is not okay to deliberately undermine our electoral process by spreading information that a person knows to be false, and to do that for the purpose of undermining the process. So that is an important statement of principle, and we need to have parameters that ensures the integrity of our electoral process against this kind of behavior.
And when it comes to political parties that promote hatred, why now ask for legislation to address this? What are you seeing? Are you seeing a rise in complaints? Are you seeing a rise in groups that are trying to apply for party status that's concerning? Why now?
So, I mean, we have seen a rise in terms of ideologically motivated violent extremism and hate speech. That's been reported upon most recently by the director of CSIS, for example. So we are seeing a rise. We have had an instance in the past where there was a party application that did give rise to complaints and serious allegations. There is currently no mechanism in place right now to address this issue. So if there is a hate group that wishes to register as a party, right now it could do so, and in so doing would gain access to a number of benefits: party lists, electoral lists, free television, tax credits on contributions. So this is illegal speech as we speak. This is not a matter of making new illegal speech, but it's a matter of protecting the electoral process from that and having a mechanism in place that does not involve the chief electoral officer in what could at some point be partisan disputes.
Okay, Christian Noël, Radio-Canada, à vous la parole.
En fait, ma question en français touche aussi un peu la même que celle d'Ashley. Comment se fait-il qu'on n'a pas ce processus-là qui empêchait... En fait, pourquoi c'est important d'avoir un processus qui empêche les groupes haineux de former un parti politique?
Vous savez, le statut de parti enregistré donne un certain nombre de privilèges. D'abord, ça donne un certain, excusez l'anglais, un certain standing, une certaine plateforme à un groupe. Ça donne accès à des crédits d'impôt pour les contributions. Ça donne accès à un régime de radiodiffusion privilégié. Ça donne accès à des listes d'électeurs. Donc, il y a tout un ensemble de bénéfices qui viennent avec le fait d'être un parti enregistré. Et face à ce qu'on voit là comme une montée du discours haineux, Et je pense que c'est nécessaire qu'il y ait un mécanisme en place qui n'existe pas là en ce moment, qui permette d'arbitrer. Et je pense que le seuil doit être assez élevé. Ce n'est pas simplement le fait d'avoir un individu, membre d'un parti, qui exprime des propos malheureux. On parle là d'un parti dont un des principes fondamentaux, c'est la propagation de la haine contre des groupes. Si ça existe, s'il souhaite à s'enregistrer, il doit, je pense, y avoir des mécanismes pour arbitrer ça et déclarer que ces groupes-là ne sont pas admissibles ou ne devraient plus être admissibles au statut de parti enregistré.
À un niveau plus général, le rapport que vous présentez aux parlementaires aujourd'hui identifie, j'imagine, à cause du changement à l'ère numérique, certaines menaces et vous essayez de combler les brèches. Quelle est la principale menace et la principale brèche que vous espérez fermer avec ça?
Écoutez, je pense que le rapport couvre un ensemble de sujets. Il vise notamment à recalibrer le régime des tiers qui a évolué au fil des années. Donc, il vise à accroître l'accessibilité. Mais il vise aussi, entre autres, à faire face à un certain nombre de menaces. Mais j'en ai mentionné là, dans mes propos d'introduction. Certainement, le financement des tiers, ça fait un certain temps qu'on regarde ça. Il n'y a pas de solution facile, mais comment est-ce qu'on fait pour s'assurer que ou diminuer le risque du financement étranger pénètre dans notre processus électoral par le truchement de tiers. Et comment est-ce qu'on s'assure qu'il y a des mécanismes pour faire face à des situations de désinformation là, qui seraient délibérées pour miner le processus électoral.
Pardon, mais pour la seconde partie de la question, comment vous comblez cette brèche-là?
Bien, il y a plusieurs recommandations. Au niveau des tiers, ce qu'on dit, c'est que ce que je dis dans mon rapport, c'est qu'il doit y avoir une distinction entre des tiers que ce soit des entités corporatives, des syndicats qui ont des activités courantes, qui ont des revenus au Canada et qui peuvent continuer d'utiliser leurs propres revenus pour financer des activités électorales réglementées. Quand on parle cependant d'organismes qui vivent essentiellement de contributions, qui reçoivent une part importante de leurs revenus à partir de contributions. En ce moment, ces groupes-là peuvent s'inscrire comme tiers et peuvent déclarer une bonne partie de ces contributions-là comme étant leurs propres revenus, dans la mesure où ce ne sont pas des contributions qui visent spécifiquement des activités réglementées, elles sont déclarées comme étant leurs propres revenus. Donc, ça peut venir d'autres groupes, ça peut venir d'autres groupes au Canada, à l'étranger, il n'y a pas moyen là, de tracer ça. Alors, dans ces cas-là, je propose un mécanisme pour s'assurer que seules des contributions provenant de particuliers qui sont soit citoyens canadiens, soit résidents permanents, puissent financer les tiers.
Okay, Marcia McLeod, Globe and Mail, please go ahead.
Hi there, good morning. I'm interested in late mail-in ballots or special ballots, excuse me, and in particular the changes between 2019 and 2021 going up from 1.5% to 7.3% of all special ballots becoming late and not counted. And I'm curious, if you could talk a bit about, more than, 90,000 people whose ballots weren't counted, like what we know about those people and if they're from certain parts of the country, or I know you referenced remote communities or in your report, and if you could just say a bit about that.
First and foremost, what we know is they tend to be people who applied fairly late in the process for a special ballot. So by the time they received the ballot and the time they return it, it did come in late. I think you touched a finger on something important, which is the comparison with 2019, where we had the same regime in place. And of course, smaller volumes, but that does not impact percentages of late ballots. And the key difference was 4 days. So that's, in a world of snail mail, 4 days makes a big difference. And that's why one of the recommendations is to extend, in certain circumstances where there is not a fixed date, extend by a small period the length of the election. But there are many other ways of achieving an important reduction in the number of mail-in ballots. And so I have a range of recommendations in my report to address that. It's quite possible to address this problem by selecting a few of those recommendations, not necessarily all of them.
With respect to that, an extra 4 days, do you believe that in the most recent election that the vast majority of those ballots could have been counted with an extra 4 days?
I don't have exact numbers, but certainly, yes, the vast majority came trickling in the days immediately after polling day. So yes, that would make a big difference. But again, there are many factors that play into the calculus of the length of the election. I'm making that decision. And so there are other ways, even in a short election period, to facilitate mail-in ballots, and that includes pre-registration. It includes changes in the date of candidate nominations. It includes allowing an elector to vote for a party, not just a candidate, so that early in the campaign, BC has that, and they process most of their mail-in applications well before close of nominations, and they have a much lower rate of late ballots. So there are many, many ways of making improvements to the regime to reduce late mail-in ballots.
Was there an observable geographic trend at all with respect to the late ballots?
I don't believe that there was an observable geographic trend overall. There were certainly variations between ridings, but nothing that points to a particular trend.
All right, thank you. So we'll now go to Zoom. Just a reminder, if you are on this call, to please raise your hand so that I can get to you. I see a number of you joining in, but you haven't raised your hand, so I'm not sure if you do want to ask a question. We'll start with Marie Wolf from the Canadian Press. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello. You mentioned misinformation and foreign interference. I just wondered if you could give us your assessment of how serious a problem you believe this is, and where you think this interference is coming from specifically.
So I'm not particularly interested as Chief Electoral Officer in where, in terms of whether it's foreign or domestic. My main concern is on misinformation about the voting process. I'm not interested in what may be characterized as misinformation on party platforms, candidates' positions on political matters, but really on misinformation and disinformation, which is deliberate misleading of electors on the voting process. We already have some measures in the legislation to deal with that. Following the robocalls scandal many years ago, there were provisions added to that for impersonation. We have pre-existing provisions where it causes interference with the vote. But there's nothing right now in the legislation where there is a deliberate campaign to undermine the process or undermine confidence in the results of that process. So this complements a number of existing provisions. For the most part, though, our role is to inform Canadians and react to misinformation or confusion online and push out correct information about the voting process. So that is the main of our efforts, but there needs to be some legal parameters, I think, to address the growing trend of mis and disinformation.
Follow up, Marie?
Yeah, I wondered if you could give us some idea of the parameters that could be put in place when it comes to making false statements. Because as everyone knows, during an election, there's constant commentary about whether it's worth voting. People make statements about candidates all being the same. Not all of these statements are strictly accurate. But would that come within the parameters of the Act and count as a false statement? Or what sort of things are you trying to capture here?
No, that's a good question, and it's important to realize that what I'm trying to capture here is a very narrow category of misleading statements. So it has to be deliberate. It has to be for the purpose of undermining trust in the process or the results, and it has to be on the electoral process per se. So, for example, if somebody's saying that we're using tabulators that count or discount certain votes predominantly, of course, neither of that is true. We don't use tabulators, and if we did, there's nothing wrong with tabulators, but not ones that would discount certain votes. So if we have narratives of that nature that seek to deliberately undermine trust in the results of an election or trust in the process, then there needs to be a measure in the legislation to clearly indicate that this is not acceptable in our electoral democracy.
Okay, the next question is from Karina Roman, CBC News. Go ahead.
Yes, hi there. You have a number of recommendations. I'm wondering, since it's up to parliamentarians to take it on and decide whether to go forward with any of them, whether you could prioritize for us, if you had to pick sort of the most important ones to get done soon in time for the next election, what would you choose?
I don't have a good answer to that questions. I think we'll work with parliamentarians to examine those recommendations, see which ones they feel are more pressing. Certainly, I do feel that we need a number of safeguards to protect our electoral process. But I do think the recommendations around communications in the digital age are overdue. I think our Elections Act needs to be modernized. I do think we need to recalibrate the third-party regime in some ways to make it simpler, more coherent, but also to address funding by third parties. So that, I think, is an important area of reform in my mind.
Follow up, Karina?
Yeah, so when you talk about overdue, I guess for any of them, I'm wondering if, we will have future elections. This is based on actually 2 elections that have already happened. Do you have a warning to Canadians and parliamentarians about what will happen to our democracy and our elections if these recommendations are not acted upon?
I think these are important recommendations, but at the same time, I would not want to give the impression that we are in a dire situation. As I said at the outset, we do have a healthy electoral framework. On the whole, Canadians trust our democracy in numbers that are quite encouraging. They continue to trust our electoral process despite the general trend in distrust in institutions. So we have a good process, but it needs to be recalibrated periodically, and this is part of what's happening now. So we'll need to take the time and look with Parliament at how we can improve our process and keep it up to date.
Okay. Does anybody have another question? We have a few more minutes left. If not, Christian Noël, vas-y.
En français, tout à l'heure, vous parlez de désinformation sur l'intégrité du processus électoral. Est-ce qu'on pourrait appeler ça la recommandation Trump?
Je vais vous laisser le soin de la qualifier. On a tous vu, que ce soit au Canada ou ailleurs, des discours qui sont peut-être un peu déplorables et qui n'encouragent pas la confiance dans le processus électoral. Alors, ce que je dis, c'est que dans les cas où ce serait délibéré et que ce soit fait pour miner la confiance, on doit avoir des mesures qui répondent à ces comportements-là.
Ashley?
You just noted that there's a high level of trust in Canada, perhaps compared to other countries. But I'm curious if during the pandemic, at a time where we have seen a decline in trust in governments and institutions overall, if you've also noticed that when it comes to the electoral process.
No, it's a good question, and we have not. So overall, when you look at our surveys, 98% of electors found that the process is easy to go through, easy to vote. 91% of Canadians have trust in the process, trust in the administration of the election. And these are numbers that are very comparable to what we've had over the years. So they've been fairly steady. I think we have to be careful not to take those numbers for granted, though. I think we need to be vigilant, and we've seen declines in other areas, and we've seen declines in trust in democracy around the world. So we need to be alert to challenges. But overall, Canadians continue to trust our electoral process and our administration of elections.
Marcia?
Particularly in light of the pretty historic low turnout in Ontario's election, I'm curious if there are things that you have on the top of your mind with respect to encouraging high voter turnout at the federal level?
We know that by far, the main drivers of turnout are political. They're not within the parameters of election administrators. I think our role as administrators is to remove barriers, is to facilitate the process, and we have a number of recommendations to do that. We're also working on improvements outside of the legal framework or within the existing legal framework. But the overall dynamic of participation is by far mainly driven by political factors.
Okay, so this is the last call for people who are on Zoom. If you have another question, raise your hand now. I'll get you on. If not, then we will proceed. Okay, that appears to be all the questions we have for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. This concludes the press conference. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.